Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. In this video I'll finally be presenting my fully completed Mitsubishi Zero in 1/48 scale, which many of you know is Eduard's new tool for the aircraft. The build went pretty smoothly overall, so let's get right into this video. As of making the video, the model is available in two boxings, a double kit based around the Pearl Harbor attacks, and a single kit that features various marking options from throughout the war. The latter is the option that I ended up going for, and it is of course a Profi Pack edition, meaning that in the box there is the usual array of dark grey sprues, clear plastic and decals, as well as photo etch parts and canopy masks, which are a really nice touch. The main parts are exactly what you would expect from a brand new Eduard release. Perfectly recessed panel lines, perfectly in scale, as well as a beautiful array of rivets that cover the entire model. Eduard truly has gone above and beyond with this kit. Obviously the make or break will be the overall fit of the parts, however, spoiler alert, any problems that did come up were minimal at worst. You gotta love a nice set of clear parts, and these don't disappoint. One thing that I love that Eduard does with their clear stuff is frosting the struts and areas that won't be clear on the final model. What this allows for is much more accurate mask placement and a better grip for the paint where it needs to be. The decals are the standard Eduard deal with removable cover film once they are set in place. This is kind of an essential step, as leaving the film on leaves a bit of a ridge around the larger decals. Then of course the photo etch parts, which in this case are of Eduard's steel variety with lovely colouring and fine details. Let's get this build started. After a bit of clearing up and sanding, it was straight into photo etch work. For this purpose it was of course necessary to use CA glue, as standard modelling cement doesn't affect metal at all. Any coloured photo etch parts would simply be added after the painting stage. I thought I'd just take this moment to say thanks to anyone who has decided to become a channel member, supporting my work on a whole new level. My channel membership scheme hasn't been fully announced before now, but it's now up and running. Not only is it a great way of supporting the channel if you do like my work, but it also features various perks and bonuses including early access to content, as well as 4K image downloads, constant build updates and video mentions. You can find out more by clicking the join button down below. Obviously there's no pressure at all, but it is there if you're feeling it. All support is of course massively appreciated. Right, let's get back to the build. With many of the cockpit aspects assembled, it was primer time. For this purpose I used Mr.Mahogany Surfacer 1000, which I've recently taken a big liking to. It's a very nice base for a lot of different colours and sprays really nicely. That is, if you thin it properly, unlike in that first clip. All primers and metallic shade were sprayed using my Harder & Steenbeck Ultra at 20 psi with a 0.4mm nozzle. Following the primer was a coat of silver. The idea behind this was to add a layer of chipping varnish on top, which would later be used to remove some of the top green coat, adding some nice convincing chips to the cockpit interior. Before laying down any varnishes or chipping fluid, I took the opportunity to add a clear turquoise mix to the area behind the cockpit, which in the real aircraft was not painted with cockpit green. You'll see me use the same technique later on in the build for the wheel wells and landing gear struts. I wasn't too bothered about the transition line between colours being that crisp, as I would later mask it for the cockpit green. Following a coat of chipping fluid, the AK real colour shade was laid down all over the cockpit. I tried to keep this layer as thin as possible whilst still achieving good coverage, as this would aid the chipping process massively. Once it had all dried, it was time to whip out the toothpick and tap water to get to work. The water was allowed to soak in a bit before working on it, as this helped to loosen the green top coat ready for scratching out some chips. The process isn't particularly quick, though this allows for some more precise marks to be created. Yeah, you remember what I said about that masking earlier? That worked out great. I then finished off the painting by picking out certain elements with the Vallejo model colour black, as well as various other shades that were required. I tried experimenting a little bit with the main guns, and instead of going straight for a pure gunmetal finish, I used a very soft 9B pencil to highlight any ridges on top of a black base. I think it worked out pretty okay. Now for those coloured photo etch elements. The seatbelts were first to go on, shortly followed by various instrument panels and switchboards. Again, CA glue was used for this task. The main dials on the main instrument panel itself were given some cover glass using unthinned Mr.Color GX lacquer varnish, which dries to a pretty convincing finish. A bog standard dark brown pin wash was then used to pick out any details in the cockpit that needed it, with any excess being blended in to some extent with a white spirit dampened brush. The cockpit could then be assembled. The sidewalls were first added, with the instrument panel coming next. Following the assembly of the two fuselage halves, the entire cockpit tub simply slides into place. When it came to painting more bare metal areas in the wings, I decided it would be a good idea to use some old Tamiya X-11 silver that I had lying around, instead of using the Vallejo metal colour that I normally use. As you can imagine, this was a big mistake and I learned my lesson. With the landing gear bays done, let's move on to the engine. The plastic parts included in the kit were by no means bad, however I felt like spicing them up a little bit. This was done by using some 0.25mm copper wire to add those missing fuel injection lines. Preferably, I would have used some thinner lead stuff, though this was the finest wire I had available, so I had to roll with it. Holes were simply drilled in the cylinders where the lines had to be inserted, and the wire was glued in place with CA glue. Gunmetal was used to coat the entire engine, providing a nice base for further colours to be hand applied. And here it is, not the best engine, but much better than the stock option in my opinion. A nice thing about this kit was the jig included for the engine cowling. It allowed for easy and accurate assembly, which in the end meant that no filling was required to create a nice result. As I hinted towards earlier in the video, any gaps or seams that did come up were literally non-existent. Because of this, I didn't want to risk filling any details with normal model filler, so I instead used carefully placed flexible CA from VMS, which was later sanded down flush with a variety of sanding sticks. Mr.Color H-125 was used to paint the exterior of the cockpit, which would be locked away behind the rear cockpit glass section. The same colour would later be used to paint the engine cowling. Mr.Mahogany Surfacer 1000 was yet again used to prime the entire model, this time with the correct thinning ratios. A single coat sufficed and it produced a very smooth surface for modelling. The modelling itself was done in various stages, the first of which was made up using the main colour, aka RC302, mixed in a 50-50 ratio with deck tan. This lightened it up nicely whilst maintaining the small amount of saturation that the main colour inherently has. This mixture was marbled at random with the boundaries of the panel lines. The next marbling layer again featured RC302, this time mixed with white. This desaturated tone was sprayed along the edges of the panels, picking them out and giving another layer of depth to the model's surface. Finally, some dirtier patches were added with the AK airbrushing stencil, along with the base colour mixed with an earth tone. It was now finally time to lay down the main colour. This scheme features the same grey all over, so those multiple mottling layers were very important in adding some variation to the surface. I made sure not to spray the colour too thick, so as to not hide the textures that I had spent so long adding before. Of course, the control surfaces of the Zero are fabric instead of aluminium, so they were then masked off and sprayed with the base shade mixed with sail colour. I didn't film it, though I wasn't entirely happy with the overall shade of the model, so after much deliberation I decided to spray a heavily thinned coat of the main colour mixed with yellow-green, which successfully gave the model a nice greenish tint characteristic to many Zeros. Some mottling was then applied to the engine cowling, featuring some really nice thinned paint yet again. Seems to be a running theme in this build. Oh well. As I mentioned before, cowling colour was then sprayed on top of this. Prior to the decals, a layer of the lovely Mr.Color GX100 gloss varnish was sprayed all over the model, providing a great base to avoid any potential silvering. The decals themselves were of course up next, and were laid down with the classic combo of microset and sol. They were a bit stubborn at first, though a couple of micro sol layers forced them to conform to the surface detail nicely. Following a 24-hour wait, the film peeling began. This had to be done very carefully in order to avoid removing the colour itself. You'll see in the final images that the right hand side of the fuselage decal suffered a bit of a tear, however I'm putting this down to battle damage. Weathering was initiated with a light brown oil wash, following a nice matte coat of GX114. Brushed into all recessed details on the model surface, any excess was subsequently removed with either a white spirit dampened brush or cotton bud, depending on which one was more practical. Any streaks of oil or gun smoke were then added, this time with unthinned oil paint blended in using a soft brush. This effect can be built up easily over various layers, so it was important not to add too much at once. A final bit of oil weathering that I applied was a blended effect around the edges of the panel lines. This helped to make them pop out a little bit more, as well as adding another element of dirt or grime build up on the aircraft surface. For the first time ever, I actually used a toothpick to add chips to the model. I found that it created a pretty convincing effect, second to actual chips created using a layer of chipping fluid. These were added to both the cowling and the rest of the model. Removing the canopy masks from this kit was probably the most satisfying process of the whole build. Definitely makes up for the expert job in the cockpit earlier. It was now just a case of adding the final bits and pieces that make the model complete. All of these were painted using the exact same processes seen earlier in the build, so I didn't bother highlighting them specifically. And here it is, fully completed and looking pretty nice if I do say so myself. Overall, it was an incredibly fun kit to build and paint. The fact that it was so expertly engineered helped massively, as it allowed me to focus on more enjoyable things such as adding more detail and tonal variation. Speaking of which, despite being a completely monotone scheme, I feel like it came out pretty interesting in the end, even if the tone had to be corrected here and there. You may also notice that I haven't added an antenna to the rear of the cockpit. For some odd reason, this scheme I went with didn't seem to feature one, which is a bit odd, but it is what it is. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the video and comment your opinions down below. I'll see you again in the next one. Bye!